Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John. Today we're starting to look at John chapter 13. So to get us started, let's read the first couple of verses. Now it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress. All right, let's stop there. It's just before the Passover festival. Jesus knows that the hour has come. That was mentioned in the last chapter. Jesus said, the hour has now come. That's the hour of his sacrificial death on the cross. He loved those who were his own, and so he's spending this last moments with them, teaching them as much as he could to prepare them for what's going to happen on Good Friday, and of course the wonder and glory of Easter morning. It also says the evening meal was in progress. Okay, so what evening meal was this, and what night of Holy Week is this? Now let's look at a couple of things. Back in chapter 12, verse 1, we are told that it was 6 days before the Passover when Jesus came to Bethany. All right, that's 6 days before the Passover. So what day is that? Well, in verse 12 of chapter 12, it says, the next day, Jesus goes into Jerusalem. That day is identified as Palm Sunday. So, the 6 days before mentioned in verse 1 of chapter 12 is obviously Saturday. So on the Saturday before Holy Week, Jesus is back in Bethany, and they give that dinner in his honor, which time Mary anoints him for burial. Then the next day on Sunday, he goes into Jerusalem. That's Palm Sunday. And then in chapter 13, it says it's just before the Passover festival, all right? And the evening meal was in progress. Now, as we read through chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and etc., we're going to find that Jesus has a lot of conversation that night of the evening meal with his disciples, teaching them. And we're going to see from some of the events mentioned, such as the betrayal of Judas, which is mentioned in this evening meal. And also later on, he's going to be arrested, and that's going to start the series of events that lead to the crucifixion. So we know this evening meal was the meal on Thursday night. So when it says the evening meal was in progress, this is the meal on Thursday evening. It's just before the Passover. And in this last night, Jesus is with his disciples. This last meal he's taking with them before all the events that will lead to the crucifixion tomorrow, and then of course the resurrection on Sunday morning. We're going to see several chapters are given to the conversation around the table that night and the events of that night as Jesus teaches them. Now, there's one more thing to mention. It says this, the evening meal, we've already identified this as Thursday night. Now, we know from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that Jesus is celebrating the Passover with his disciples at that evening meal. It's quite clear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that this evening meal is the Passover meal. And of course, he gives it new meaning. The communion we know of, the sacrament of communion, comes out of this Passover meal when Jesus says, this bread is my body given for you, and this cup is my blood shed for you. We know all that. So what does John say? It was just before the Passover festival. And also we're going to notice later in the Gospel of John that when the early Friday morning, when the Sanhedrin takes Jesus before Pilate, it says they will not go into Pilate's home because that would defile them, and they want to receive the Passover meal later that day or that evening. So why is it that the disciples and Jesus are receiving the Passover on Thursday night, but John tells us that the priests were going to receive the Passover on Friday night, and John also tells us that at this Thursday evening meal, it's just before the Passover festival, not at the actual Passover festival. How do we understand that? Well, we're not quite sure. There's two possibilities. It may be that the priest received the Passover meal a day after everyone else did, so that everyone else was receiving on Thursday night, and the priests were going to receive the Passover meal on Friday night. That's one possibility. But another possibility is that the Passover meal was being received on Friday night by the Jewish people, but because the crucifixion was coming, Jesus had the Passover a night early with his disciples. Now, I tend to think that is the more probable explanation. I think the Passover was actually set for Friday and for Friday evening, But Jesus and his disciples celebrated it a night earlier because Jesus knew what was coming. And also that makes it clear that when Jesus is on the cross on Friday afternoon, that's the exact time the Passover lambs are being sacrificed for Jewish families to receive their Passover meal that night, which makes it clear that Jesus is the Passover lamb. So I think that's the probable explanation. I think the Passover was on Friday, and Jesus on the cross is our Passover lamb. His blood covers us. And Jesus celebrated the Passover meal a night early with his disciples so that he could explain its meaning to them and point to the fact that tomorrow I will be the Passover lamb. But anyway, it's the night before the crucifixion. It's Thursday night. Jesus is sharing his evening meal with the disciples, and he has much to teach them about what is about to occur. So the next number of sessions, we're going to be looking at this teaching for the next few chapters in which Jesus is giving them so much instruction about what is about to happen. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John.